The first time Albert Fletcher saw Martha Brooks, she was standing on the far edge of Redemption Canyon with her arms spread wide like she was trying to measure the sky, and the sight of her knocked every reasonable thought clean out of his head. It was the spring of 1873, a year when the New Mexico territory still breathed wild and untamed, when the land itself seemed to push back against every soul foolish enough to try to tame it. Albert had been running cattle on the eastern rim of the canyon for 3 years by then, a stretch of red rock country so beautiful it almost made a man forget how hard it was to survive there. The canyon cut between his land and the neighboring property like a wound in the earth, dropping some 200 feet to a ribbon of Silver Creek below, its walls painted in layers of amber and rust and violet shadow. He had always thought of it as a boundary, a fact of the land that simply was. He had never once thought of it as something that might keep him from anything he wanted. But that afternoon in April, with the cottonwoods just beginning to push green, he looked across that canyon and saw a woman he had never seen before. And for the first time in his 32 years of living, the 200 feet of empty air between himself and another human being felt like the cruelest thing nature had ever devised. She was tall and dark-haired, wearing a deep blue dress that was already dusted at the hem from whatever work she had been about, and she was studying the canyon rim with an intensity that made him think she was not simply admiring the view. She had a small leather-bound notebook in one hand and a pencil in the other, and she was writing something, pausing, looking down into the gorge and writing again. She did not look like a woman who was lost. She looked like a woman with a plan. Albert stood there at the edge of his own property, his horse ground-tied 20 feet behind him, and he watched her for a full 10 minutes before she looked up. When she did, their eyes met across that impossible distance, and she did not look away the way most women would have. She looked directly at him, gave a short nod as if acknowledging a neighbor she passed every morning, and went back to her notebook. He rode back to his ranch house that evening with her image burning behind his eyes. He learned her name through the particular telegraph of small-town gossip that moves faster than any wire in a place like Millhaven, the nearest town, which sat 7 miles south of his property. The widow Calloway's land on the western rim had sold in late winter, which everyone already knew, but what nobody had confirmed until now was who had bought it. Martha Brooks, the postmaster's wife, told the feed store owner, who told Albert's ranch hand, Domingo Reyes, who came to Albert that very evening with the news delivered in the casual tone of a man who did not yet understand its significance. "A woman from Santa Fe bought the Calloway place," Domingo said, leaning against the corral fence and rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers. 30 years old, they say, widow. Her husband was a surveyor, died 2 winters back from fever. She has no family nearby, just herself and whatever money he left her. Albert absorbed this information the way dry ground absorbs the first rain of spring, completely and all at once. "What does she intend to do with the land?" he asked. Domingo shrugged. "Nobody knows yet. She moved in last week. Brought a wagon full of tools, they say, serious tools, not household goods kind of tools." Albert nodded slowly and said nothing more, and Domingo, who had known his employer long enough to read silences, let the matter drop. Over the following weeks, Albert found more reasons than usual to be near the eastern rim of his property. He told himself he was checking fence lines, which needed checking. He told himself he was scouting the upper pasture, which could always use scouting. He was not the kind of man who lied to himself habitually, so the self-deception sat poorly with him, but he kept doing it because the alternative was admitting something he did not yet know how to handle. He watched Martha Brooks work. And she worked like no woman he had ever seen, and he had known plenty of hard-working women in his time. She was clearing the scrubland along her rim, pulling brush and measuring distances with a surveyor's rod that she handled with the ease of long familiarity. Her husband's profession, he realized. She had learned from him. She moved with purpose and economy, never wasting emotion, always knowing what she was reaching for before her hand moved. She had a mule named for its stubbornness. He could tell, because she argued with it in a way that suggested a long and not entirely affectionate relationship. He began to notice the smaller things, the way she tucked her pencil behind her left ear when she needed both hands, the way she would stop in the late afternoon and stand very still at the canyon's edge as if listening to something in the wind coming up from below. He noticed that she worked alone entirely, which troubled him, because the western rim was no place for a woman without someone to call on in trouble. He wanted to ride around. He could have ridden around. The canyon had a crossing point 12 miles north where a natural bridge of stone made passage possible, and the road south through Millhaven connected both sides easily enough. It was perhaps an hour's ride by the most direct route. He knew this. There was nothing stopping him from calling on her, introducing himself as a neighbor, offering any assistance she might need. He did not ride around. He told himself it was because he did not want to presume. He told himself a woman who worked the way she worked did not need a man appearing at her door uninvited to tell her she looked like she could use help. He told himself a lot of things in those first weeks, and most of them had enough truth in them to be defensible. But the core truth was simpler and harder to say out loud, which was that he was afraid. Albert Fletcher had not been afraid of much in his life. He had driven cattle through Apache country, had survived a stampede that killed 2 of his horses and broke his left arm in 2 places, had weathered blizzards and droughts, and a particularly ugly dispute with a neighboring rancher that had come very close to gunfire before cooler heads prevailed. He had never been afraid of physical danger in the way that men who lack imagination tend not to be afraid. But he was deeply afraid of making a fool of himself, and more specifically, he was afraid of standing in front of a woman who moved through the world with that kind of quiet self-possession, and finding that he had nothing worth saying. So he watched from across the canyon, and the spring deepened into summer. By June, he had learned more about Martha Brooks from observation than from any conversation, and the knowledge sat in him like a stone in a deep well, substantial and permanent. He had learned that she rose before the sun, that she built her own cook fire and let it die down by mid-morning before the heat became oppressive. He had learned that she read in the evenings, sitting outside with a book in her lap until the light failed entirely. He had seen her lose her temper with a fence post that refused to cooperate, and then laugh at herself afterward with a generosity he found unexpectedly moving. He had seen her sit quietly at the canyon's edge in the blue-gray hour before dark, looking across at his side of the land without knowing she was being looked back at. He began to wonder what she thought about in those quiet hours. He began to wonder if she was lonely. He was lonely. He had been lonely for years without quite admitting it to himself, in the way that a man who fills his days completely can pretend the nights are not as long as they are. He had built his ranch up from a raw land grant into something real and solid, 700 acres with a good herd, and a house that was beginning to look like a home rather than just a shelter. He had Domingo and 2 other hands, Billy Tate, and a young man called Santos who had come up from Chihuahua 3 years ago. He had neighbors he liked well enough in Millhaven, and a postmaster who played passable chess and didn't mind when Albert won. He had, by any reasonable measure, a full life. But he went home in the evenings to an empty house, and he had stopped noticing that fact the way you stop noticing a familiar ache. And then Martha Brooks appeared on the opposite rim, and he noticed it again very sharply. The summer of 1873 was dry, as most summers in that country were, and by July the creek at the bottom of the canyon had dropped to a thin thread of water that glittered between pale stones. Albert sent Billy Tate into Millhaven for supplies in late July, and Billy came back with the usual goods and the usual news. And among the news was the item that Martha Brooks had been into town and had asked about the mineral rights on her property, and had spoken with the land office agent for the better part of an hour. Albert chewed on this information thoughtfully. A woman interested in mineral rights was a woman with a specific kind of plan. Her husband had been a surveyor. She had been measuring the rim, taking notes. He thought about this over several evenings and arrived at a conclusion that both impressed and worried him, which was that Martha Brooks was considering some kind of excavation or development of her property that would require significant planning and resources. Whether it was timber, which the canyon rim had in patches, or something she had surveyed in the rock below, he could not say. He thought about riding around to ask her. He thought about it quite a lot in the evenings. He did not ride around. What he did, and he recognized immediately that it was a lesser but safer thing, was begin a habit of small acknowledgments when they were both near the rim at the same time. A wave, a lifted hat, small recognitions that they existed in each other's world. She returned them with the same prompt courtesy she had shown on that first day, without warmth and without coldness, simply with the straightforward manner of someone who believed in being civil to neighbors regardless of distance. He began to look forward to those small exchanges with a fervor that embarrassed him. Domingo noticed, because Domingo noticed everything and had the wisdom to say nothing until one evening in late August when they were mending tack by lantern light, and the silence had gone on long enough that it had become a kind of conversation itself. "The woman on the other side," Domingo said carefully, threading a leather lace through a cracked piece of bridal work. "I heard she is thinking about the old timber stand on the north part of her rim." "Is she?" Albert said. "Also I heard she goes into town alone every time she goes. Every time, just her and that mule." Albert said nothing. "It's a long ride alone from that property," Domingo said. "She seems to manage." "She does," Domingo agreed. He paused. "You could ride around, you know. 12 miles is not so far. I know how far it is." "Do you?" Albert set down the piece of leather he had been working on and looked at his ranch hand directly. Domingo was 47, a compact and serious man from a family that had lived in this territory when it still belonged to Mexico, and he had the kind of patience that came from a life spent working with difficult animals of all species, including humans. He met Albert's look with perfect equanimity. "I will ride around when I have something worth saying," Albert said. "Men who wait until they have something worth saying," Domingo replied, returning to his work, "sometimes find the person they wanted to say it to has already gone and found someone else to listen." Albert picked up his leather work. He said nothing more, but Domingo's words settled into him and stayed. The summer gave way to fall, that dry golden fall of the New Mexico territory, when the cottonwoods turn brilliant yellow along the watercourses, and the air carries a crystalline quality that makes distances seem both larger and more achievable. Albert had lived through enough seasons in this country to feel a particular quality of attention in the autumn air, as if the land itself was paying closer attention to things before the winter closed in. He was at the rim on an afternoon in early October when he saw something that made him straighten out of his characteristic lean and stare hard across the canyon. Martha Brooks was not alone. There was a man with her, broad-shouldered and wearing a town coat that marked him as someone who did not work with his hands for a living. He was standing close to her, not inappropriately close, but close enough that his posture communicated a particular kind of familiarity. And he was talking with animation while she listened with an expression Albert was too far away to read clearly, but which he felt in his chest as something uncomfortable. He watched for 20 minutes, hating himself for watching, and then the man in the town coat helped himself to Martha's notebook, which she allowed, and he made notes in it himself, pointing at various features of the rim and the canyon below, and she listened and replied and once laughed at something he said. Albert rode back to his house faster than was necessary and spent the evening doing inventory in the barn until his hands were occupied enough that his mind could not dwell. The man came twice more that week. Albert knew this not from watching the rim, because he told himself firmly that he would stop watching the rim, but from what Domingo reported having heard in Millhaven, because of course Millhaven was also watching. The man's name was Gerald Hartman. He was an investor from Albuquerque, and he was interested in Martha Brooks's property as a potential site for a small mining operation connected to a silver vein that ran through the canyon walls. The fact that Hartman was interested in the property for business reasons settled some of the discomfort in Albert's chest, but did not entirely resolve it, because Hartman was also, by Millhaven's collective assessment, a man who paid close attention to attractive widows in a manner that went beyond strictly commercial interest. Albert thought about this information for 3 days. He thought about it while working cattle, while repairing the roof of the smaller barn, while eating his solitary suppers in the house that was beginning to feel particularly empty in the autumn evenings. He thought about it with the specific quality of attention that a man gives to something that matters to him more than he has admitted. On the 4th day, he rode to the northern crossing. The natural stone bridge 12 miles up the canyon was wide enough for a horse if the horse was calm about the exposure, and Albert's gray mare, Patience, was a horse of considerable good sense, so the crossing took only a few careful minutes. He rode south along the Western Rim Road, which was rougher than his own side and less familiar, and arrived at the gate of the former Callaway property on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October with his hat clean and his best shirt on under his coat, and absolutely no clear plan for what he was going to say. The property was more developed than he had expected from his distant observations. The brush clearing he had watched was part of a larger project that now revealed itself as the beginning of a proper fence line along the rim, careful and well post set, running further than he had been able to see from across the canyon. There was a kitchen garden that had been productive and was now being put to bed for winter, the plants cut back and the beds turned under. The house itself, which had been run down badly under the widow Callaway's last years, had new chinking between the logs and a repaired porch and windows that were clean. She had been busy. He had known she was busy. But standing here on her side of the world and seeing what she had accomplished alone in 6 months hit him with a force that was partly admiration and partly something else he needed a moment to identify, which was the recognition that Martha Brooks did not need saving, had never needed saving, and was going to be just fine with or without his intervention or his concern or his interest or his fear. This recognition should have been deflating. Instead, it made him want to meet her more than he ever had before. The mule was tied to a post near the barn and eyeing him with the particular hostility that mules reserve for strangers. Albert dismounted and tied Patience at a respectable distance and walked to the porch and knocked on the door, and then took his hat off and held it in front of him because his mother had raised him right. The door opened, and Martha Brooks looked at him from a height that was still somewhat below his own and said, "You're the man from the other side of the canyon." "Yes, ma'am. Albert Fletcher. I've been meaning to ride around and introduce myself." She considered him for a moment with brown eyes that were direct and intelligent, and gave nothing away for free. She had a smudge of something on her right cheek, and her hair was coming loose from its pins on one side, which somehow made her look more formidable rather than less. "I've been wondering when you would," she said. "Come in. I have coffee." She said it exactly the way you say it to someone you have been expecting, and not just today, but for some time, and that expectation in her voice traveled through him like the first warm day of spring. Her house was neat, in the way of someone who had given up luxury for function, without complaint. A worktable covered in papers and drawings took up most of the main room, and the papers were, as he had guessed, survey maps and geological notations in her husband's careful hand, supplemented by her own annotations in a different but equally precise script. There was a bookshelf along one wall that held more books than he had seen outside of Santa Fe, and a good iron stove, and 2 chairs pulled up near it. She poured coffee from a pot that had clearly been on the stove for a while, which suggested she had not been expecting him this exact afternoon, and set his cup in front of him on the table with a matter-of-factness that he appreciated. "Martha Brooks," she said, sitting across from him, I expect you already know that. I do, small town. Very small, she wrapped both hands around her cup. You run cattle. 700 acres, about 150 head currently. You're doing something with the mineral survey. One eyebrow moved slightly. You've been paying attention. From a distance, he said, and felt immediately that he had said too much, and then felt her look change slightly, become something more curious and less neutral. I have been too, she said quietly, paying attention, from a distance. The afternoon light came through the window at a low October angle and lay golden across the table between them, and Albert Fletcher understood in that moment that he had wasted 6 months being afraid of exactly nothing, and that the realization came both too late and just in time. They talked for 2 hours. He had been afraid he would have nothing worth saying and found instead that he had a great deal to say, and more importantly that she did too, and that the conversation moved between them like water finding its level, easy and natural, and occasionally surprising. She told him about her husband, James Brooks, with the measured directness of someone who has made peace with grief without being diminished by it. James had been a good man and a good surveyor, and she had loved him genuinely, and his fever had taken him in 3 days in the winter of 1871, before she had understood how serious it was, and she had spent the year after his death figuring out what she wanted her life to be. What she had decided was that she wanted to make use of what she knew, which was surveying and geology, and the particular kind of patience that comes from spending years in a landscape learning to read it rather than simply looking at it. The canyon property, which she had read about through a Santa Fe land agent, was sitting on what her husband's preliminary notes suggested might be a workable vein of silver ore in the lower canyon walls, if it could be accessed properly. She had come to investigate and had found that the property was also simply the most beautiful piece of land she had ever stood on, and that had settled the question. Albert listened to all of this with the quality of attention he had not given to another human being's words in years, and he told her about his own history, which was less dramatic: a family ranch in Texas, 2 older brothers, a decision at 24 to take his portion of a small inheritance and come west and make something entirely his own. He told her about the learning curve of cattle in this particular country, the water problems and the elevation, and the way the red rock terrain ate through horseshoes at a rate that kept the Millhaven blacksmith in good business. She laughed at this, a real laugh without self-consciousness, and the sound of it did something to the air in the room. He went home as the evening stars were beginning to appear, riding north along the Western Rim Road with his heart feeling 3 sizes too large for his chest, which he recognized as an undignified condition, but could not particularly bring himself to object to. Domingo was waiting up with the lantern still burning in the barn, ostensibly checking on a mare that had been off her feed, but really, Albert knew, waiting to see if he would come home at a reasonable hour or not at all. How was it? Domingo asked, not looking up from the mare's stall. Good, Albert said. Good, very good. Domingo looked up then, and whatever he saw in Albert's face made him nod once with the satisfaction of a man whose advice has been taken and proven sound. Over the following weeks, Albert rode around the canyon to call on Martha Brooks with a regularity that became the primary topic of conversation in Millhaven. He did not care about this even slightly. He brought things that were useful, because he had noticed she was too practical to appreciate purely decorative gestures: a proper axe to replace the one she had whose handle was cracking, a supply of good lamp oil, the name of a reliable man in Millhaven who could help her with the heavier work of the fence line she was building. He brought these things without fuss and without expectation of gratitude, and she accepted them the same way, practically and with acknowledgement but without elaborate thanks, because she had already identified him as someone who would find excessive gratitude uncomfortable. She was right about this. She was right about a number of things regarding his character, with a promptness that might have been unsettling if it had not felt so much like being seen. Gerald Hartman came twice more to discuss his mining proposition, and she dealt with him politely, and with the clear-eyed competence of someone who understood contracts and mineral rights better than he had assumed she would. And by their second meeting, he had modified his approach considerably from investor to widow to investor to equal, which she appreciated. Albert heard about these meetings from Domingo and did not feel as he had felt in October, which confirmed something he was already coming to understand about the nature of what was developing between himself and Martha Brooks. He trusted her judgment. It was a simple thing and a profound thing simultaneously. She mentioned Gerald Hartman to Albert herself, one afternoon when he had ridden around and found her going over papers at her work table, which she often was. "Hartman is offering a fair price for the mining rights to the lower eastern face," she said, without looking up from the figures she was reviewing. "I have been thinking carefully about whether to accept." "What's giving you pause?" Albert asked, settling into the chair across from her that had begun to feel like his chair. "If I accept and he brings in a mining operation, it changes the canyon significantly. The creek, the north section where the timber is. I have been considering what I came here for and whether a mining lease is compatible with it." She finally looked up. "What do you know about Hartman?" "He's legitimate. His financing is real. He has done business in the territory for several years without serious complaint." "That's what I had heard too." She tapped her pencil on the table. "I think I will offer him a limited access agreement rather than full mineral rights. The vein he's interested in is in the lower eastern face. It doesn't require him to disturb the upper rim." Albert nodded slowly. It was a sound solution, one that protected the majority of her land while generating the income that would make her ranch viable. "That is a sensible approach." "I thought so." She smiled, and there was something in that smile that had not been there in the early conversations, something warmer and more private. "I wanted to know what you thought, though." The words sat between them like a gift he had not been sure he would ever receive. She wanted to know what he thought. Not because she needed his permission or his approval, but because she valued his perspective, because she was already building something with him, something quiet and mutual and real. He rode home that evening with the stars enormous overhead and the cold, clean air of November coming down off the mountains, and he felt a happiness he had almost forgotten the shape of. The winter was hard, as winters in that country tended to be, with snow coming down off the mountains in early December, and the temperature dropping to places that made the livestock miserable and the work of a rancher both endless and urgent. Albert's cattle operation required everything he had during those months: the constant vigilance over water sources and feed supply, the nursing of animals through the particularly brutal cold snap that hit in January and lasted 11 days. He still rode around to see Martha 3 times in January and twice in February, which required considerably more effort in winter conditions, but which he accomplished by the simple expedient of wanting to badly enough. She had settled her agreement with Hartman and had spent the winter in the way she spent all her time, productively and thoughtfully, working on the geological survey she was compiling of the full canyon system, which was, she had explained to him, the project she most cared about. Her husband had begun it years ago as a professional document, but she was expanding it into something more comprehensive, a record of the canyon's formation and ecology and the mineral deposits throughout its walls. "It won't make me rich," she told him on one of his winter visits, with a self-awareness about this that he found endearing rather than troubling, "but it is work that I believe matters. The Territorial Survey Office has expressed interest in a copy when it is complete." "It matters," he said simply. She had looked at him for a moment with an expression that crossed her face quickly and then was controlled, something vulnerable and pleased that she did not quite want him to see yet, and he had seen it and said nothing about it, and that nothing said everything. By March the snow was easing and the first tentative warmth was returning to the land, and Albert Fletcher was in love in a way he had no more ability to deny than he had the ability to deny the arrival of spring. It was not the tempestuous variety of love described in the novels his sisters had read, or the purely transactional arrangement that passed for love in some marriages he had witnessed. It was something that had grown from observation and conversation and mutual respect, something that had its roots in 6 months of watching her from across a canyon before he was brave enough to cross, and then in 4 more months of slow accumulation of knowledge of each other. He knew that she hated unfairness in the way that people who have thought carefully about ethics hate it, not loudly but deeply and permanently. He had seen her once in Millhaven speak, with quiet and devastating precision, to a merchant who had given a Navajo man short change, and thought no one who mattered was watching. He knew that she was methodical when she was nervous and funny when she was comfortable, and that she was almost never frivolous but had a precise and dry sense of humor that appeared when you least expected it. He knew that she had been watching him from across the canyon too, in those months before he came around, and that this knowledge lived in him as the warmest thing he had ever been told. It was late March, on a day when the air had finally committed to spring, and the canyon rim was beginning to show the first small flowers in the rock crevices, that he rode around to her place and found her gone from the house. The mule was in its corral, so she had not ridden into town. He looked around and then went to the rim, where he had learned she often went to work when the weather was fine. She was not standing at the rim. She was below it. He leaned out over the edge, his heart giving a single hard knock of alarm, and then he saw her 20 feet down the canyon wall, moving with careful confidence along a ledge he had not known was there, her survey equipment slung over one shoulder, making notations as she went. "Martha," he called, and his voice came out sharper than he intended. She looked up, found him, and waved with the hand that held the pencil. "I am fine. There is a good ledge here. I have used it before." He waited at the top with his hands clasped behind his back and his jaw tight until she climbed back up 20 minutes later, steady and unhurried, and swung herself over the lip of the rim with a competence that made it clear she had done this many times. "You could have told someone you were going down there," he said, which was not quite what he had meant to say but was what came out. She looked at him with those direct brown eyes. "I suppose I could have. Who would you suggest I tell?" The question hung in the clean spring air. "Me," he said. "I would suggest you tell me." Something shifted in her expression. It was very slight and very significant. "All right," she said quietly. "I will tell you." They walked back to the house together through the new grass, and when he helped her hang her survey equipment on its pegs inside the barn, their hands occupied the same space for a moment, and neither of them moved away. He turned toward her and she was already turned toward him, and the distance between them was less than it had ever been, and it was still not nothing. "Martha," he said. "Albert," she said, "I have been meaning to say something to you for a while." "I have been thinking you might," she said, and there was the ghost of that dry humor in it that he loved so well, and it made it easier. "I think you are the finest woman I have ever met," he said. "I have thought so since before I ever spoke to you, which I recognize is not entirely rational, but I have thought so more since I did speak to you. I would like, if you are willing, to continue spending time with you in a way that is not simply neighboring. I would like to court you, if you will permit it, with the understanding that I know you do not need anything from me, and that whatever I am offering is not out of any belief that you do. It is simply because I would rather spend my time with you than without you." She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be a moment. "That is a very careful speech," she said. "I have been composing it since November." Laughed that real unguarded laugh, and then she reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the barn's wooden rail, and he turned his hand and held hers. "Yes," she said, "you may court me, Albert Fletcher, and for what it is worth I would also rather spend my time with you than without you. I have thought so for some time." "How long?" he asked. She considered with the scrupulousness she applied to all honest reporting. "Since about your third visit, possibly the second." He thought about this. "What happened on the third visit?" "You noticed that my axe handle was cracking before I mentioned it, and brought me a new axe the following week without making any production of it. I found that very attractive." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he started laughing too, and they stood in the barn in the new March light holding hands and laughing, and it was one of the finest moments of his life. The spring of 1874 was a courtship conducted in the serious and purposeful way of two people who were both past the age of games and had, by different roads, arrived at a clarity about what they wanted from life. Albert came to the Western Rim every week, usually twice, and she came to his side twice that first spring, the long ride around through Millhaven that took a full morning, and both times she examined his operation with the same analytical interest she gave to everything, asking questions that revealed she had been paying attention to what he had told her about cattle ranching across many months of conversation. On her second visit to his property, standing in his upper pasture looking over the herd with the spring sun full on both their faces, she said, "Your eastern fence line needs repair in the section near the North Watercourse. I know. I have been meaning to get to it. You should get to it before the summer. The cattle will find the weakness." "You're right," he paused. "How did you notice that? It's barely visible from the trail." "I have good eyes," she said simply, and then with the particular timing she had for these things, "and I have been paying attention to your land since before you came around to mine." He looked at her with the sun in his eyes and the spring smell of new grass and distant water on the air, and he said, "Martha, I believe I love you." She held his gaze steadily, and in the steadiness was the answer, but she said it too, because she was not a woman who let important things go unspoken. "I believe I love you too, Albert. I have been fairly certain of it for some time." He reached out and took her hand the way he had in the barn, and this time they stood like that in the open pasture in the middle of his working ranch, with the cattle moving in the field below and the vast blue sky overhead, and it was perfectly right. The town of Millhaven, which had been observing the situation with the dedicated interest of a community that does not have a great deal of other entertainment, arrived at its own conclusions around this time and began treating the matter as settled, which meant that, when Albert rode in for supplies in April, the postmaster's wife asked him about his plans in a way that assumed he had some, and when Martha came in for her monthly delivery of geological mapping materials, the merchant had begun asking if she needed anything special ordered, with a particular emphasis on the word special that made her eyes narrow slightly. She mentioned this to Albert on his next visit. "They mean well," he said. "I know they do. It is still somewhat presumptuous." "Small towns presume," he agreed. "The only cure is to give them something definite so they stop speculating." She looked at him with her head slightly tilted. "Is that a practical suggestion or something else?" "Martha," he said, "I was wondering if you would marry me." She put down the cup she was holding very carefully. Outside, the spring wind was moving through the pinon pines with a sound like the land breathing. "Yes," she said. "Albert, yes, I will marry you." He crossed the room to her, and she was already rising from her chair, and he put his hands on either side of her face with the tenderness of a man who has understood precisely how valuable the thing he is touching is, and he kissed her for the first time. And she kissed him back with a warmth that told him everything about how long she had been waiting for him to be ready. They were married in June of 1874 in the small church in Millhaven, which could not contain everyone who wanted to attend, and so the ceremony spilled out onto the steps and into the yard, with a good portion of the surrounding population finding reasons to be in town that day. Domingo stood up with Albert, and a woman named Clara Vargas, who had been Martha's closest friend in Santa Fe, had made the journey north for the occasion. And the ceremony was simple and direct, and neither of them cried during it, though both of them came very close. The celebration afterward in the churchyard was the kind of gathering that the territory threw with enthusiastic competence, with food brought from a dozen different kitchens and music from a fiddle player, and a man with a guitar who could keep the dancing going as long as the participants held up. Albert danced badly and knew it and danced anyway, because Martha danced well and he wanted to be where she was, and she laughed at his footwork with complete affection and no cruelty, and pulled him through the patterns until he was almost not terrible. Billy Tate, who had a gift for observation that exceeded his 16 years, and who had grown up around the Fletcher ranch enough to feel proprietary about Albert's happiness, stood at the edge of the dancing and watched his employer whirl the new misses. Fletcher threw a pattern with an expression on his face that Billy described later to Santos as like a man who has just figured out he won something bigger than he thought he was playing for. Santos, who was 20 and had recently started keeping company with a girl from the Vargas family in Millhaven, nodded as if this information was personally relevant to him. Martha brought two things to the marriage that Albert had not quite anticipated, and both of them changed his life. The first was the geological survey, which occupied a dedicated corner of whatever room was large enough to contain it, and which grew from a project into a genuine scientific document over the following year, as she worked at it with the systematic devotion she gave to everything she cared about. The Territorial Survey Office did indeed take a copy when it was complete, and it was eventually cited in published geological literature about the New Mexico Territory, which was, Albert thought privately, exactly the appropriate recognition for a woman who had spent years learning to read a landscape. The second thing she brought was her own particular way of looking at the world, which began immediately to inform the way Albert ran his ranch. He had been a good rancher before, careful and competent, but she had the geologist's habit of looking beneath surfaces, and she began asking questions about the land and water and soil of his property that led him to think about the future of the operation in ways he had not considered. Her husband had surveyed throughout the territory, and she had absorbed a great deal of his knowledge about water in arid country, and her suggestions about the development of a secondary water source for the northern pasture turned out to be not only sound but essential when the following summer was dry enough to have been a serious problem without it. Domingo, who had initially offered her the respect due to his employer's wife without particular warmth, revised his opinion within 3 months to something considerably warmer, largely on the strength of the water project, but also because she had once, without any drama, climbed up to the barn roof to fix a section of loose boards that he had put off dealing with and had done it correctly. After this, Domingo spoke of her to the other hands, with the particular respect of a man who has recognized a practical competence he was not expecting. She had her own money from the Hartman agreement, which was hers, and which she kept separate not from any distrust of Albert but from the practical self-knowledge of a woman who had learned to be her own resource. He respected this completely. They had agreed before the marriage, in a conversation that had been both businesslike and deeply affectionate, that her Western Rim property would remain hers and his Eastern Rim operation would remain his, and that they would combine their efforts on both as a shared project. It was an unusual arrangement for 1874, and the fact that they had arrived at it without difficulty was itself evidence of the particular quality of their understanding of each other. The summer of 1874 was the happiest of Albert Fletcher's life, and he was conscious of this while living it, which was a rare and fortunate thing. He was conscious of it in the mornings when he woke before dawn and could hear her already at the stove, because she rose before him every day, and he was still not used to there being someone in the house to wake up to. He was conscious of it in the evenings when they sat on the porch of the house together in the cooling air and she read, and he mended something or simply sat and looked at the wide sky, and felt the specific peace of a man who has arrived somewhere he was trying to get to. He was conscious of it in the small daily moments that are the actual substance of love, which are not the dramatic declarations but the cup of coffee placed at your elbow without being asked, the way she said his name when she had found something interesting in her survey work and wanted to show him, the way she listened to him, with the full attention she gave everything, when he talked about the ranch or about his family in Texas, or about anything at all. He was also conscious that the canyon, which had been the boundary between two separate lives for those 2 full seasons he had loved her from a distance, was still there. They crossed it regularly, he for the stock he grazed on the western rim section near her better grass, she for her survey work on the eastern face, but the crossing was always the long way around, 12 miles north to the stone bridge or south through Millhaven. He had thought about this occasionally, about the hours of travel that the canyon cost them in a week, but he had filed it as an unchangeable fact of the geography. He had not discussed it with Martha, and had not known she was thinking about it. He discovered that she was thinking about it in August, when he came back from a week-long cattle drive north, and found her at the rim with a collection of materials he had not seen before: long straight timber poles and coils of heavy rope, and a stack of papers that turned out to be engineering drawings. She looked up when he rode in with the warm directness of her greeting that always reached him before he was fully dismounted, and said, "I need to talk to you about something." He looked at the materials and then at the drawings. "What are you planning?" "I want to build a bridge," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Across the canyon," she said, in case this was not clear. He looked across the canyon, which was at this point as familiar to him as his own reflection, the amber and rust walls, the thin Silver Creek far below, the opposite rim where he had stood for 6 months watching her. The distance was perhaps 200 feet at this narrowest point near the north end of both their properties. "Have you done structural calculations?" he asked. "I have. I also consulted with a man in Santa Fe who builds bridges professionally. He reviewed my drawings and suggested some modifications, which I have incorporated." She spread the drawings on the flat surface of the boulder they had long since adopted as a work table near the rim. "A timber span with rope guide rails. It will need to bear the weight of a horse, so I have designed to that specification with a safety factor." He looked at the drawings carefully. They were precise and detailed in the same careful hand she brought to her survey maps. She had done the calculations herself and had them checked. She had sourced the materials. She had thought through the anchoring systems on both rims. "This is significant work," he said. "Yes. You planned all of this while I was on the drive." "I have been planning it for a while. I wanted to have the drawings finished and verified before I showed you." He looked at her. "Why?" She met his eyes steadily. "Because I did not want you to feel obligated to support the idea simply because I had mentioned it. I wanted you to see it properly designed and thought through before you made a judgment about it." He understood what she was telling him, which was that she had made sure this was real and sound and good before presenting it to him, because she was not asking for his approval or his permission. She was giving him the facts so that he could make a genuine decision. It was exactly her, completely and entirely her, and it was exactly why he loved her. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Domingo and your hands for the anchoring work on the eastern rim." Domingo specifically because he knows this kind of heavy work better than anyone I have access to. The timber I have already arranged to have delivered from the north. The rope and hardware I have from Santa Fe. "When do you want to start?" "Next week, if Domingo is available." He looked at the canyon, at the 200 feet of empty air between this side and that side, and then he looked at his wife with her surveyor's drawings and her careful plans in her hands that had already built so many things, and he said, "Domingo is available. I will tell him tonight." She nodded. And then something crossed her face that was not her usual composed directness, something softer and less armored. "Albert," she said, "yes. When I stood on my side and looked at you standing on yours in the beginning before you came around, I always thought that if I could get across without the 12 miles, things would be easier. I thought that a great deal." She paused. "I wanted you to know that this is something I have wanted for a while, since before we were married." He looked at her for a long, full moment. "I know," he said. "I have thought the same thing. I just never thought to do anything about it." "I know," she said, and her voice was gentle with it, the gentleness of someone who understands a specific kind of patience and does not judge it. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, very gently, and she turned her face slightly into his hand for just a moment. "Let's build a bridge," he said. It took 3 weeks. Domingo threw himself into the project with an enthusiasm that Albert found somewhat touching, as the man had clearly been waiting for a large engineering challenge for years. He and Martha worked from her drawings with a precision that required significant adjustment of the timber on site, but which proceeded without serious error, which was testament to the quality of the original planning. Billy Tate turned out to have a good head for heights, which was useful, and Santos was indispensable with the heavy rope work, having grown up around fishing boats on the Gulf Coast before an improbable sequence of events had brought him to high desert cattle ranching. Albert worked alongside all of them, because it was his canyon too and his bridge, and because watching his wife direct a construction project from engineering drawings she had made herself was the kind of thing that made a man want to be present and useful, and not merely supervisory. There were 2 days of complicated anchor work, drilling and setting the heavy bolts on both rims that would hold the main tension cables. There was a day of real difficulty when the first main timber span was swung across, and the wind in the canyon came up at an inconvenient moment, and they nearly lost 2 hours of work into the gorge. And Martha's voice did not waver once during the crisis, as she called out adjustments to angles and load distribution, with the calm of someone who has already done the mathematics and knows where the safety margin is. When the crisis was resolved and the span was secured and everyone had their breathing back to normal, Billy Tate looked at her with uncomplicated admiration and said, "Mrs. Fletcher, where did you learn to do all this?" "From my husband," she said. "And from 10 years of paying attention." "Yes, ma'am," he said with a reverence that made Domingo smile. The decking went on over the final week, heavy planks laid and secured with the rope guide rails on either side. Albert walked it twice before it was finished, testing the solidity under his boots, feeling the structure respond with the appropriate rigidity and no alarming flex. The canyon dropped away below his feet, and the wind came up from the creek in that particular canyon updraft, and he stood in the middle of the bridge, 100 feet of empty air on each side of him, and looked east to his land and west to hers. On the day the bridge was finished, they did not make a ceremony of it. Martha simply went to the eastern end, where Albert was standing, and they walked across it together, her arm through his, the boards solid under their feet, the guide ropes warm from the August sun. The crossing took perhaps a minute and a half at a walk, 200 feet, a minute and a half, 2 full seasons of looking across and wanting. When they reached the western side, she turned and looked back across, and then she looked up at him, and her face was doing something complicated that he understood entirely. "There," she said quietly. "There," he agreed. He kissed her there on the western end of the bridge she had built, with the canyon air rising around them and the hawks that lived in the wall far below wheeling in the thermal currents, and she held onto his coat and kissed him back, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more about it because everything had been said. The bridge changed everything in small ways. Domingo could ride across to help with work on the western rim without losing half a day to the detour. Martha could be at the eastern rim with her survey equipment in 2 minutes instead of an hour. Albert could walk across in the evening to see her from across the canyon and be back in time for the night check on the cattle, without the whole enterprise taking half his evening. The ranch and the geological survey operation intertwined more easily, problems on either side of the canyon becoming shared problems as naturally as everything else between them had become shared. The Hartman mining operation began on the lower eastern face in late September, a small affair with 4 workers who came up from Albuquerque and who worked neatly within the terms of the limited access agreement. Martha oversaw their work with the careful attention of someone who had negotiated the contract terms personally and intended to see them honored, and Hartman himself came up in October to review progress and found everything in order, and Martha in full command of what was happening on her land. Albert was present for this meeting, working at a fence repair 20 yards away and making no attempt to appear to be doing anything other than being available if needed, which he and Martha had agreed on beforehand without either of them making it explicit, because it was not necessary to make it explicit. Hartman was an intelligent man who had revised his understanding of the situation at Redemption Canyon significantly over the course of the year, and he concluded his October visit by shaking Martha's hand with the respect due to a capable business partner, and telling Albert that he was a lucky man, which Albert acknowledged with a sincerity that Hartman evidently found unusual enough to remember, because he mentioned it to an associate in Albuquerque in terms that eventually reached back to Millhaven, where it added usefully to the town's general good opinion of both Fletchers. The fall of 1874 settled over the canyon country with a beauty that felt personal. Albert and Martha walked the rim in the evenings when the work allowed, sometimes separately and sometimes together, and the canyon was the same canyon it had always been, ancient and indifferent and magnificent, but his relationship to it was entirely changed. He had spent 2 full seasons looking across it at something he wanted and being afraid to go around. She had spent those same seasons on the other side, watching and thinking, and eventually simply deciding to reduce the distance herself. He thought about this often, not with regret exactly, because regret seemed like the wrong response to something that had worked out, but with a kind of rueful understanding of himself and a deep gratitude for her. She had not waited for him to solve the problem of the canyon. She had solved it herself, not because she was impatient or because she doubted him, but because she was a woman who, when she saw a problem and saw a solution, built the solution. That was simply who she was. And he had understood, watching her do it, without her needing to explain. In November, Martha told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before the day had properly started, sitting across from him at the breakfast table with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup in the way she had. And she said it with a directness that was characteristic, and a vulnerability underneath the directness that was less familiar and therefore more precious. He looked at her for a moment across the table in the early light, and then he got up and went around to her side and knelt next to her chair and put his head against her shoulder for a moment, which was not something he was normally given to, and she put her hand on his head and held him there. "Are you happy?" she asked, and her voice was quiet. "I cannot adequately describe how happy I am," he said, which was the truth. She laughed softly, and he felt the laugh through his shoulder where it rested against her. They did not tell Millhaven immediately, because the winter was early that year and there were more pressing things to attend to than social visits. But by January, the news had made its own way to town through the particular information network of a small community, and the response was warmly enthusiastic in the way of people who have followed a love story from a distance and feel some proprietary investment in its progress. The winter was long but not unbearable. Martha's survey work moved indoors, which meant the main room of the ranch house was largely occupied by geological notations and correspondence with the Territorial Survey Office, and Albert developed the habit of working at the kitchen table when he had paperwork to see to, because the main room was Martha's domain during the winter months, and he had learned to respect the organization of her working space with some respect for his own continued domestic harmony. Domingo's wife, Esperanza, who lived in Millhaven but who had become a regular presence at the ranch over the summer and fall, began coming out more frequently as the winter deepened, ostensibly to help Martha with various domestic tasks, but primarily, both women understood, because Esperanza Reyes had delivered 4 children of her own and had opinions about how a woman ought to be cared for in pregnancy, and intended to share those opinions regardless of whether they were solicited. Martha, who had a particular quality of grace in accepting help when it was given without strings, received Esperanza's opinions and assistance with genuine appreciation. Albert overheard them once in the kitchen arguing cheerfully about the correct preparation of a medicinal tea made from local plants, with Esperanza citing 30 years of family practice and Martha citing a medical text she had acquired in Santa Fe. And the argument had concluded with the production of a tea that incorporated both approaches, and which Martha declared excellent. By the following spring, the canyon bridge was as much a part of the landscape as the canyon itself, already beginning to weather to a color that blended naturally with the red rock. Martha had put additional drainage cuts in the decking boards to prevent water pooling and had reinforced the anchor bolts before the spring thaw, and she inspected it with the same systematic attention she gave to everything she had built. Albert walked it every morning on his way to check the near pasture of the western rim section, and sometimes in the evenings on the way back, and the crossing never lost its quality of meaning for him. It was always the same 200 feet. It was always Martha who had built it. Their son was born in April of 1875, on a clear morning when the canyon country was at its most beautiful, and they named him James Albert Fletcher. James for the husband she had loved and lost, and Albert for the man who had shown her that the capacity to love did not have a fixed quantity. Naming the boy for both his fathers, present and absent, was Martha's idea, and Albert had agreed to it without hesitation because it was right, and because he was the kind of man who understood that a woman's history is part of what she brings you, not something to be erased. James Albert Fletcher was a dark-haired and serious baby who regarded the world with brown eyes inherited directly from his mother, and Domingo held him on the day he was 2 weeks old with the expression of a man who is being shown something sacred and knows it. Billy Tate, at 17, was awkward with the baby in the way of young men who have not yet held one, but he tried earnestly, and Martha coached him with her characteristic patience. And by the end of the afternoon, Billy was managing adequately and James was not crying, which both parties seemed to consider a success. Santos had, during the winter, formalized his intentions toward the Vargas girl, whose name was Rosa, and their courtship was proceeding along the traditional lines of her family's expectations, which required both patience and a degree of formal engagement with her parents that Santos was navigating with the combination of determination and nervousness that Albert recognized from personal experience. Albert had offered his advice on one occasion when Santos asked for it, which was simply that patience and genuine respect for the woman's own preferences would solve most of the apparent obstacles, and Santos had received this advice with the gravity of someone who was going to use it. The summer of 1875 was good, better than the previous two in terms of water and grass, and the Hartman mining operation had found a workable pocket in the eastern face that was productive, without being the kind of large operation that changed the character of the canyon. Martha had continued to keep close watch on the environmental terms of the agreement, and had made 2 amendments to it over the winter when it became apparent that the original drainage provisions needed to be strengthened, and Hartman had accepted these amendments without significant objection, because he had learned in his dealings with her that her amendments were always technically sound. The Geological Survey was submitted to the Territorial Survey Office in September of 1875, 2 full years after she had arrived at the property on the Western Rim. It was a document of genuine scientific quality, and the man from the survey office who came to discuss it with her spent 2 days at the canyon in conversation and field verification, and left with the copy and a letter of formal acknowledgement that cited her methodology and the scope of the data. Albert read the letter 3 times and then handed it back to her and said, "I am very proud of you," which was the simplest and most complete thing he could have said. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the cedar box where she kept the documents that mattered, and she took his hand and held it for a moment. "I have been thinking," she said after a while, "that there is another project." "Tell me," he said, and settled in to listen. There was, she had determined from her survey work, a spring on the northern section of the Western Rim property that could be properly developed to create a reliable water source for both properties through the dry months. It would require engineering and some labor, but the survey data made clear that it was viable. She had already drawn preliminary plans. Looked at the plans, which were characteristically precise and well considered. "You have been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since last winter," she admitted. "I wanted to finish the survey first." He nodded. "Domingo should see these." "I thought so too." She paused. "Albert, do you know what I like about this canyon?" He looked at her, and she was looking out the window at the near distance where the canyon rim was visible through the trees. "Tell me." "It is very old and very patient," she said. "It has been here a great deal longer than any of us, and it will be here after us. But it is not indifferent. Things live in it. Things grow in it. Things cross it." She turned to look at him, and her expression was the warmest he had ever seen it. "I think we will be very happy here." He looked at her, and at James in his small cradle near the warm stove, and at the plans for the spring project spread on the table, and out the window at the canyon that had once been the most impossible 200 feet of his life and was now the most familiar geography he knew. "We are very happy here," he said. "Right now. Already." She smiled, and it was the smile he had waited 2 full seasons to deserve, the one that held everything, the intelligence and the warmth and the humor and the love, the bridge builder's smile, the woman who had looked at an obstacle and decided to solve it, who had looked at a man watching her from the opposite side of an impossible distance, and decided that the distance was simply a problem to be addressed. He pulled his chair next to hers and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the ease of someone who has found exactly where she is supposed to be. Outside, the canyon held its ancient shape between the two rims, amber and rust and shadow, and the little bridge stood across its narrowest point, weathered and solid, a practical structure of timber and rope that had been built without being asked for by a woman who knew what she wanted and knew how to build things, and which had carried them back and forth across the impossible space between 2 separate lives, until the 2 lives became one. The years that followed were good years, the kind that accumulate into a life worth having. Santos and Rosa Vargas were married in the spring of 1876, and the small house on the north end of the Western Rim property that Albert and Martha had built during the previous winter became their home. And Rosa turned out to have a gift for the kitchen garden that complemented Martha's entirely practical approach to growing things. And the 2 women developed a friendship that had its own quiet quality of mutual recognition. Billy Tate grew from a 16-year-old with good eyes and too much eagerness into a young man of steady competence, who eventually, at 19, expressed a serious interest in a piece of land to the north of the Fletcher properties, and an intention to start his own small operation. Albert helped him with the land purchase, and Domingo helped him with the knowledge of cattle in that country, and Martha gave him a copy of the survey data relevant to his water sources, which information proved more valuable than almost anything else he was given. Billy's gratitude for this was expressed in the straightforward way of a young man who has been genuinely helped, and he was in their lives regularly ever afterward. James Fletcher grew up on both sides of the canyon, walking the bridge from the time he could walk steadily, and the 200 feet of air below the timber planks were as unremarkable to him as any other feature of the landscape he had been born into. He was a quiet child who had his mother's eyes and her systematic approach to things, and his father's patience and his father's capacity for deep attention. He learned to read from Martha's books and to ride from Albert and to understand land and water from both of them. And by the time he was 5, he was already asking questions about the geology of the canyon walls that his mother answered with a seriousness and specificity that Albert found both moving and mildly intimidating. The mining operation wound down in 1878 when the accessible portion of the vein was exhausted, exactly as the original survey had suggested it would be. Hartman settled the final terms of the agreement with Martha in a meeting in Millhaven that took most of an afternoon, and concluded with a handshake and a mutual acknowledgement that the arrangement had been, by both parties' account, fair and professionally managed. The western face of the canyon healed over the following years, the disturbance of the operation greening over in the wet seasons until it was barely distinguishable from the surrounding rock. Martha began a second geological survey in 1878, this one of the broader watershed north of their properties, a project commissioned by the Territorial Survey Office on the strength of the first document. She rode north for this work regularly, sometimes alone and sometimes with Albert when his cattle operation allowed, and the survey took 2 years of intermittent field work that she conducted with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. By 1880, the Fletcher Ranch was a well-established operation that had weathered 7 years of the New Mexico Territory's particular challenges, with the specific resilience that comes from two intelligent people who know what they are doing working toward the same goals. The cattle herd had grown and diversified. The spring development Martha had planned in 1875 was complete and had proven its value in 3 subsequent dry seasons. The house had been expanded twice, once for James's room and once for the second child, a daughter born in 1877 whom they named Clara Esperanza Fletcher, for Martha's Santa Fe friend and for Domingo's wife, which had been Martha's idea and which had made Esperanza Reyes cry in the specific way of a woman who is deeply honored by something she was not expecting. Clara was a different temperament entirely from her brother, loud and laughing and physical from her earliest days, climbing anything that would hold her weight and absolutely fearless about heights, which was convenient given where she lived. She walked the canyon bridge at 4 by herself, going back and forth several times while Martha stood at one end with her hands folded, and her face composed in the expression Albert had come to recognize as Martha trying not to show she is holding her breath. When Clara had finished her 4th crossing and came back to Martha's end and reached up her arms to be carried, Martha picked her up and held her tightly enough that Clara made a small sound of protest, and Martha said, "Good. Well done," in a voice that was almost perfectly steady. Albert, who had been watching from the other end, walked across with a perfectly ordinary stride and said nothing because there was no need. Domingo retired from active ranch work in 1881, at 55, with a regard from both Fletchers that was expressed practically in the form of a small pension arrangement, and personally in a dinner that lasted 4 hours, and at which Domingo made a speech that was characteristically brief and wholly sufficient, saying only that he had worked for a good man, and had watched that good man become a better one, and that he considered the years at the canyon among the most worthwhile he had spent, and that the beef was excellent. By 1882, which was 9 years after Albert Fletcher had first seen Martha Brooks standing on the far edge of Redemption Canyon with her arms spread wide and her notebook in hand, the life they had built together was something that had its own specific gravity, the kind of weight that comes from accumulated days and decisions, and shared meals and arguments about fence lines and conversations that continued across years, because neither of them ran out of things to find interesting. The bridge, which was 10 years old that summer, had been rebuilt once, in 1879, with heavier timber and improved anchor hardware, this time with Albert fully involved in the planning from the beginning and Domingo's complete engineering attention. The new bridge was wider than the first, wide enough for 2 people walking abreast rather than single file, and it had a proper railing on each side rather than guide ropes, because Martha had decided that if James and Clara were going to treat it as an ordinary feature of their daily landscape, it ought to have proper safety railings. He had helped her design those railings. They had spent an evening in October at the work table with measuring instruments and the engineering notes from the first bridge, and a new set of drawings that were, if anything, more precise than the original, and he had contributed ideas about the anchoring that she had improved upon, and she had suggested a railing height that he had verified was correctly calculated for the span's flexibility. And by the end of the evening, they had the plans for a bridge that would outlast both of them, and they both knew it. "Do you remember," he said, as they were rolling up the plans, "the first time you showed me the drawings for the original bridge?" "I do," she said. "You said you had wanted to build it since before we were married." "Since the winter of the first year," she said, "when you were riding around for visits and losing 2 hours to the detour every time. I thought I could solve this. And then I thought I should wait until I had the plans properly worked out so you could make a genuine decision about it." He looked at her in the lamplight of the room that had been transformed over 9 years from a sparse working space into a place of accumulated warmth and life. "You have always done that," he said. "Worked the problem until you had a real answer before bringing it to me." "I dislike presenting problems without solutions," she said. "I know. But you could have talked to me about the problems while you were working on the solutions. You could have said, 'I am thinking about building a bridge across the canyon. What do you think?' I might have helped with the thinking." She considered this with her characteristic honesty. "You might have," she admitted. "I think I was still, at that point, accustomed to doing things alone. I was not yet certain how much of this was shared." The word "this" sat between them comfortably because they both knew what it meant. "It has always been shared," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I knew it fairly quickly after we were married, but old habits are slow to release." He reached across the rolled plans and took her hand, and she turned her hand and held his. "Martha," he said, "for whatever it is worth to you, I have been completely yours since April of 1873. She looked at him with eyes that were still, after 9 years, capable of making him feel exactly as he had felt that first afternoon in the barn when she put her hand over his on the rail. "I know," she said quietly. "I think I always knew. I was not always sure I was ready for it, but I always knew." Outside, the canyon held the early stars, and the little creek far below caught their reflection, and the bridge stood solid and weathered between the two rims, and the house was warm with lamplight, and the sounds of their children sleeping in their rooms, and the New Mexico territory was doing what it always did, which was endure and persist and ask of the people who lived in it a kind of fundamental honesty about what they were and what they wanted. Albert Fletcher had wanted Martha Brooks from the first moment he saw her, and had been afraid to go around for 2 full seasons, and then had gone around, and she had already been waiting, and they had built something together that was as real and solid as the bridge she had put across the impossible space between them. James Fletcher grew up to become a surveyor and geologist, trained by his mother in the best technical school that Albuquerque could offer by the time he was old enough to go. He worked throughout the territory and eventually contributed his own survey documents to the same territorial offices his mother had. And when he was 24, he married a woman from Taos who was a teacher and who had, Martha said privately to Albert the first time they met her, the same quality of settled self-knowledge she recognized as valuable above most other things. Clara Fletcher became a rancher in the most complete sense, taking over the daily management of the combined properties by the time she was 20, because she was the one who wanted it most clearly and had the natural gift for it. And Albert began handing over gradually, and with genuine relief, the physical work that his body was beginning to find more effortful in his middle 50s. She ran the cattle operation with her father's patience and her mother's analytical eye, and a personal style that was entirely her own, direct and decisive and fair in a way that earned her the complete loyalty of the hands who worked for her. She married at 26, a man named Ezra Calloway who had no relation to the original widow Calloway but who had come to the territory from Oklahoma, and had the good sense to love Clara Fletcher exactly as she was rather than as he might have preferred her to be. He was, Albert said to Martha, a sound choice in all the ways that mattered. Martha agreed, and added that she liked his horses, which was, Albert knew, her specific form of the same endorsement. In 1890, Albert and Martha Fletcher sat on the porch of the house in the late afternoon light of an October day that was all the gold and amber of the canyon country at its best, and watched James's children, two boys aged 7 and 5, attempt to teach Clara's son, who had just turned 3, the correct way to approach the canyon bridge. The lesson was proceeding with the authority of older cousins who have complete confidence in knowledge that was, itself, delivered with the authority of people who have grown up regarding a 200-foot drop as an ordinary feature of the landscape. Martha watched this with the composed expression that Albert knew contained a great deal more feeling than it showed. "They do not find it remarkable at all," she said, "about the bridge, about the canyon, about the life that had been built across it." "No," he said. "That is as it should be," she said. "That is the best possible outcome, that they have never had to think about it." He reached over and put his hand over hers on the porch rail, and she turned her hand and held his, as she had in the barn on a spring day 17 years ago, with the same naturalness and the same completeness. The canyon spread below them, unchanging and eternal, amber and rust and shadow, and the thin bright thread of the creek at its bottom, and the bridge stood across its narrowest point, solid and weathered and permanent, built without being asked by a woman who knew what she wanted and knew how to build things. And Albert Fletcher, who had loved from across that canyon for 2 full seasons before he was brave enough to go around, who had been met on the other side by a woman already paying attention, looked at the bridge and then at his wife, and felt in his chest the particular quality of happiness that has nothing more to ask for, the happiness of a man who knows exactly where he is and knows it is where he is supposed to be. "Martha," he said. She looked at him with eyes that still, at 60, held that particular directness he had been unable to look away from the first time he saw her. "Yes, Albert. I am very glad I rode around," he said. She smiled, the full, warm, real smile that he had spent 17 years accumulating and which still reached him like the first warm day of spring. "So am I," she said, "though I will point out that it took you long enough." "I know," he said. "It is all right," she said. "I had already started drawing the plans." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and the children at the bridge turned to look at the old people on the porch being inexplicably cheerful, and returned to the serious business of teaching each other things they had already known since before they could remember knowing them, which is the very best kind of knowledge, the kind that has been built into you so thoroughly by the people who loved you and the place you lived that it no longer feels like anything you had to learn at all. The sun dropped further behind the western rim, and the canyon filled with its particular evening shadow, purple and violet and the deep amber of the stone, and the bridge was a line of solid timber across the blue air, and the creek caught the last light far below, and the Fletcher ranch settled into its evening sounds, the cattle in the near pasture, the horses in the corral, the fire already lit inside the house, the smell of supper coming through the open window. Albert held his wife's hand on the porch of the house they had built together beside the canyon she had bridged, in the life they had made from 2 separate lives across an impossible distance, and the stars came out one by one above the New Mexico territory, and everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that needed to be built had been built. And they were exactly where they had been building toward since an April afternoon in 1873, when a man stood at one rim and a woman stood at the other, and the world between them was full of possibility and waiting to be crossed.